So good evening and welcome to Town of Sydney Committee of the Whole for September 7th. We have the full council here in the chamber tonight, as along with several members of staff. We also have a couple of staff members who will be participating by video as needed. So to begin, I'd like to call things to order, and as the province has not transitioned to step 4 of the COVID-19 restart plan today, the town is not able to open the council chambers for in-person public attendance. The town will continue to ensure openness, transparency, accessibility, and accountability by allowing the public to submit written correspondence, participate by means of electronic communication, and by recording and live streaming the meetings. So I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting tonight in the territory of the Wasanich, and they've been the stewards of this land for since time immemorial. So committee, you have the agenda in front of you. Are there any additions or amendments?
Move approval of the agenda.
Okay,
Second.
so that's moved and seconded. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Moving on then, we have the minutes of the Committee of the Whole for August 9th, and those have been distributed. Are there any amendments? And if not, would someone like to move that the minutes be approved?
I'll move approval.
Okay, so that's been moved. Do I have a seconder?
Second.
Okay, seconded. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Moving on then, and the main item for tonight's agenda is the OCP Review Project, Phase 2 Summary and Key Directions Report. We have a presentation by Corey Newcomb, Senior Manager of Long Range Planning, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just share my screen here so the presentation slides come up. And make it full screen. Go back to the beginning. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that clearly. So good evening, Mr. Chair and committee members. So as mentioned, I'm here to present on the Town of Sydney's OCP Update Project, summarizing Phase 2 of the project and providing an overview of the key deliverable from Phase 2, which is the Key Directions Report. So tonight I just want to give a brief introduction to the project for those who may not be aware of it and are watching from home. Summarize Phase 1 and Phase 2 in a little more detail, the two early phases of the project, and then go over the Key Directions Report and some key aspects of that report, and then talk a little bit about next steps. So the town's OCP Update Project has been underway for over a year now. It started in May 2020 with Phase 1, which was a background review essentially, getting the project started, getting the project team together, looking at some background data, policy review and such. We started Phase 2, which is we're just ending up with this phase now, but the current phase of the project began in September 2020. And you can see at the right-hand side of the slide here some of the engagement activities we've been doing through Phase 2. So we started in September 2020 with a public launch event, both in person and online, and we've done an ideas forum, some stakeholder interviews, a sort of multi-jurisdictional government and pseudo-government organizations planning session, a design charrette with the community, a community design survey that followed that design charrette, some workbooks that members of the community had an opportunity to fill out, economic development workshop with members of the business community. We've done some extensive engagement with the Wasanich Leadership Council and Wasanich communities on the peninsula, and also engaged with youth at Parkland High School. So we're just finishing Phase 2, and as mentioned, the Key Directions Report is sort of the main deliverable from this phase of the project. Once Phase 2 is complete, we'll be moving into Phase 3, which is actually drafting the OCP. And once phase 3 is complete, we would look at the phase 4, which is the bylaw adoption process for the OCP. So just a very brief overview of phase 1. Really, it was a lot of internal work, some background research on different types of OCP reviews, things we might want to touch on during the OCP review. Did some existing policy reviews, so looking at town documents that we already have right now, the existing OCP obviously, but we've done a lot of planning work in previous years and wanting to wrap all those other policies and bylaws and documents into the current OCP. Looking at an engagement strategy and a communication strategy for how the town would be engaging with the community during this process. And we also did some early stakeholder interviews just to help set the stage for what kind of feelings were out there in the community in terms of the bigger issues and things like that. So as I mentioned, that wrapped up in August 2020, and following that we moved into phase 2. So phase 2 kicked off with a public launch, open house, and that was both in person at the Mary Winspear Centre and online. Between the online and the in-person version, about 200 people participated in that. It was about evenly split between online and in-person. That was followed by the kickoff of the Online Ideas Forum, and this was a website where members of the community could go and post an idea that they thought might be valuable for the community to pursue in the future, and people could comment on that idea and have a discussion about it. And between October and February of this year, when that website was live, we had about 150 ideas collected and discussed through that time period. This May and June, skipping around a bit here, but this May and June we had the OC Pizza Night workbook, and this is a workbook that went out to almost every household in the community, looking at Councillor Garnett and acknowledging that some households refuse ad mail, so they wouldn't have gotten those. We did try to get around that somewhat by, we do drop-offs at some apartment buildings, and also it was available online, and we promoted that through social media. So we had 162 workbooks returned. About 10% of those were group workbooks where a number of people got together and discussed the questions posed in the workbook amongst themselves and then submitted it, and the remainder were individual or couple completions. We did have a number of families who got together over dinner, for example, and filled it out as a family and discussed some of the ideas in there. And we also had at least one strata council get all their strata members together and fill it out in sort of a, I guess they had a party and a big chat, which sounded pretty fun. And we did have a raffle for pizza gift cards for that. So some members of the community did get some pizzas, and those the groups who did turn them in qualified for a pizza gift card as well. So that was positive. Another initiative we did was a sub-regional planning session. So this was a virtual event that we did with staff from North Saanich, staff from Central Saanich, BC Transit, Island Health staff, and CRD staff, and looking at some of the broader regional issues, not only between the three peninsula municipalities, but transit issues, regional issues of regional concern, green belt type of ideas, things like that. So we had a pretty productive planning session with sort of at the government level, cross-jurisdictional government level. In February of 2021, we had a design charrette, and so this is sort of an urban design planning session, I guess you could call it, where we had 50 members of the community and stakeholder groups come together, again online due to the pandemic restrictions, but come together and participate in sort of a bit of a freewheeling ideas session with the consultant helping to guide some of the ideas, but again, sort of an idea generating session around land use, design, environment, things like that. So out of the design charrette, we developed the community design survey, and this was a method to sort of proof some of the ideas that came out of the charrette, with the idea of getting broader community feedback beyond these 50 folks who volunteered to participate in the charrette itself. And I would say this is, in my time in Sydney anyway, this is one of the most successful surveys we've done, with 735 unique responses. I can't remember another survey that's even gone to half that number, so I think the feedback from that was definitely a success. And you'll see a lot of the responses to some of the questions we posed are in the Key Directions report, and provide some support for the ideas that are in there. More recently in June, we had an economic development workshop. This was with the Peninsula Chamber of Commerce, the Sydney BIA, and a number of business owners in the community. Again, looking at ideas for the future success of local businesses and the business community in general. Another positive session. Again, in June, we had a youth workshop with students from Parkland High School. Richard, one of our planners here in Sydney, went out. He's one of our younger planners, so he went out and engaged with them. I think I'm probably a bit too middle-aged for that, but yeah, Richard had a good session with these 25 students, and yeah, sounds like it was pretty high energy and successful, so that was good to hear. And last but not least, throughout this process, we've been engaging with the WSONEC Leadership Council and broader WSONEC communities on the peninsula. We've had 3 sessions with the WSONEC Leadership Council's Technical Advisory Committee and representatives of that, and staff from Town of Sydney, myself, and Central Saanich and North Saanich as well. I have to say those have been some of the more challenging conversations I've had in my career in terms of broaching issues that I think have been long simmering. And yeah, I think very, very positive sessions. Obviously just a beginning. There's a lot more work to be done there for sure. But I hope these are the outcome of that stuff can be enshrined to some degree in the OCP and help to build a relationship with the WSONEC people going forward. It was a very positive engagement process, I think. From my perspective, we topped it off with a community forum with members of the various First Nations communities, the 4 First Nations communities on the peninsula in June, and I think had some very frank dialogue. The mayors of the communities were in attendance as well, and I think it was a positive session in the end. So that's an overview of all the phase 2 engagement we've been doing. Just a couple of comments on that. I would say, in speaking with my colleagues from both Central Saanich and North Saanich, that the levels of engagement in each community have been somewhat comparable. My sense is that community members in Sydney are maybe a little more enthusiastic about engaging. Just the responses to the community design survey, I think, are well in excess of what they experienced in their, I would say, analogous surveys. Yeah, I would say, just based on discussions, a lot of enthusiasm for providing feedback in Sydney. Not saying there wasn't in the other communities as well, but very similar levels of feedback in terms of numbers. Again, similar sized communities, so I think there's a pattern there. Yeah, and I think the other point I would make is that throughout this year of engagement we've done, and I'll speak about this in a little more detail in a minute, but some very clear patterns have emerged in terms of the issues that I think people wanted to let us know about and to highlight as things that they felt were issues of concern or just things that needed more attention going forward. And not to say that no new ideas came out as the process went along, but definitely patterns emerged in terms of the things that people were talking about. And I think at this point, from my sense, we have a very clear picture of what the concerns in the community are, what the objectives of the community are, what the goals and vision of the community are in terms of what they would like to see come out of the OCP. So from my position as a planner, I think the engagement has been a success in terms of getting a clear picture from the community. And that clear picture looks a lot like this. So these are some of the main things that we've heard. And again, these are things that came out in each engagement activity. They came out in different ways, but invariably they came out as sort of the top things that people wanted to talk about, that people wanted to see addressed, and that people wanted to see built into the OCP as things to be addressed in future years. So the first is a little bit nebulous because I think if we polled the room here, we might get different definitions of seaside character from each person, but a consistent theme of maintain Sydney's seaside character. Very rarely defined, unfortunately. And, you know, I wonder too if I think from my position as a planner, when I see seaside character, I tend to think of, you know, building character or community character, but I wonder too if that's the character of the community in a social sense. So I think that's something we need to explore a little more deeply and go back into some of the feedback and see if there's any hints there as to what Sydney's seaside character is that needs to be maintained. And maybe it's undefinable, but I think, you know, generally it's that small town feel where you can talk to a store owner and they know who you are. The store is in a building that, you know, you like to walk past every day because it makes you feel good, and maybe 1,000 other different things. But that was a definite top of the list, was maintain seaside character. Right from the beginning as well, and this I think was most pronounced at the initial project launch event, were comments about improving active transportation in the community. I think Sydney is definitely a destination for cyclists, but increasingly there's a sense that, you know, and this is maybe an outcome of the pandemic as well, that people enjoy riding through Sydney, you know, as a way to get somewhere or to see their community. And yeah, consistently through engagement feedback, I think it's clear that people would like to see more cycling and or / walking, say multi-use pathway facilities where they can quickly and easily get around without having to find a parking space, or you know, they just want to go out for their family and get some exercise and not worry about their kids on bikes, you know, being in danger from vehicles or something like that. So a lot of feedback about that, making safer, more convenient active transportation facilities. The next thing was protecting the environment and addressing climate change. And of those two things, I would say that climate change was definitely frequently mentioned, but more frequently mentioned was protecting the environment from, I think, a biological standpoint, protecting the shoreline, tree protection, you know, planting native species, getting rid of invasive species. That sort of hands-on environmental focus was a big topic of discussion for sure. I've touched on engagement and reconciliation with the Wasanich peoples. Definitely support for that in the community, and for reconciliation initiatives to move forward came across very clearly. Housing unaffordability remains a concern, and that hasn't changed. And I think, you know, we've been hearing that consistently from a lot of community members over the last 4 or 5 years now, quite some time, and it remains a significant topic of concern. I think more recently what I've been hearing and through the OCP process is concern about younger people being able to move into town, a lot of concern about people fearing for their kids not being able to afford a place. So a lot of concern about the coming generation and what they're going to do when they, you know, want to buy a house or what have you. Definitely a common comment was concerns about allowing increased density, mostly specific to the downtown in Sydney. I would say actually fewer comments about density itself and more comments about building height, which is, a lot of people view those two things as the same essentially. Specifically, I would say for 5 and 6 stories in the downtown. That came across fairly clearly. A lot of negative feedback about recent buildings that are of that height, and some of the materiality and appearance of some of those bigger buildings as well. And I think a lot of those comments were as well linked to Sydney's seaside character, and so I think you can draw a line between those two things. And then finally, as with any public consultation we do, concerns about parking were raised as well. A lot of comments about the need for retired folks who maybe can't walk a longer distance to be able to park at their destination. So that was a fairly frequent comment as well. So those were kind of the big things. Obviously there was a multitude of other concerns and comments and thoughts that came across. Can't summarize everything here, but these were the main themes that emerged, definitely. So that is sort of a summary of phase 2, and I'm happy to respond to any questions at the end if there are any. So out of phase 2, which is titled Exploring Options, is the Key Directions Report. And the idea with the Key Directions Report is not to present finalized policy that will be directly included for the into the OCP. Obviously, the policy directions in the report are written in a specific way. I would stress that those specific wordings probably can and will change. We need to see how this policy interacts with the rest of the policy in the draft OCP once it's written. And, very likely there'll be some tweaks necessary to some of the stuff that's in the Key Directions Report to make sure that it works well with other things in the draft OCP. So I just want to highlight that we shouldn't get too hung up on the wording because it very likely will change. I think the idea here is that these directions are broader policy directions that staff I think are looking for feedback from this committee on in terms of generally are they acceptable to move forward with and include them in the OCP, acknowledging that the details might change, but the broader policy direction, the high level stuff is a direction that we're going to pursue. The Key Directions Report also includes a vision, a draft vision for the OCP. Again, an early draft that could very well change as we see how things fit together. Happy to take this committee's feedback on either the draft vision, the goals that are in here. I'll go over both in a minute, or any of the directions in the report, and I've highlighted a couple here that I think are worthy of potentially further discussion or feedback. And in some cases a bit of tweaking in terms of carrying them forward to the draft OCP. So looking at the draft vision, and typically I don't like to read things directly off slides, but I think in this case it might be worth just reading it out, just to hear what it sounds like. So I'll do that. So the draft vision is: the town of Sydney, known as Setines to the Wasanich peoples, continues to be a lively and welcoming seaside town at the commercial heart of the Saanich Peninsula. Sydney will build on its reputation as a friendly, inclusive community to deepen its relationship with the Wasanich peoples and reflect the rich cultural history of the area. Sydney will address the climate emergency by both reducing its emissions and increasing its resilience to shocks and change. Sydney will protect and enhance its natural areas and open spaces to create thriving biodiverse ecosystems and healthy places for recreation and reflection. Sydney will work hard to create a vibrant downtown and a thriving local economy underpinned by a healthy, diverse community, housing choice, and support of happiness and prosperity at all stages of life. So it's definitely longer than the current vision in our OCP, and very well might do with a bit of shortening up or tweaking, and I wouldn't want to get into wordsmithing in this meeting specifically, but if you do have suggestions in terms of thematic things, I'm happy to take those back and work with them in the drafting of the OCP. And again, this is something that will come forward as the draft OCP further refined and we'll be seeking further feedback on. So I think there are multiple rounds of refinement here coming, both with the committee and council and the public as well. And moving on to the goals and responding to an earlier question by a committee member before the meeting started, the intent here is that unlike the current OCP, which is structured around essentially land use categories. So we have a downtown commercial section in the current OCP, neighborhood commercial section, there's a residential section, there's an industrial section, and there are heritage and culture sections as well. But it's a very sort of siloed, maybe is a strong word, but it's very divided into those specific land use types. And the idea here is to structure the OCP around these 6 goals. And the idea is that it provides for better integration of, I would say, disparate policies that might be separated out by the land use approach, can be better integrated through the goal approach. So for example, a regionally connected, vibrant downtown, that incorporates the idea of transportation linking the land use in the downtown and the economic factors as well. So it's an attempt, this structure is an attempt to bring a broader policy set together into specific policy goals. So we've got goal 1, a regionally connected, vibrant downtown. Goal 2, a distinct seaside character reflecting local history, cultural, and reconciliation. Goal 3, connected, accessible, and livable neighborhoods that meet the needs of the whole community. So there you're talking about providing housing choice and things like that. Potentially neighborhood commercial uses where people can pop out and not have to go all the way to downtown Sydney for something they might need. Transportation choice, things like that. Goal 4, a diverse and balanced community of people supporting a thriving local economy. So again, we're looking at a more balanced demographic in that goal, and some economic factors wrapped in. Goal 5, biodiverse connected ecosystems informed by traditional, ecological, and scientific knowledge. And goal 5 there is a great opportunity to look at ecosystem protection and restoration, not just from a sort of modern scientific perspective, but wrapping in some of the work we've done with the Wasanich peoples on their way of approaching environmental protection and restoration and traditional knowledge and those things, which in a lot of cases I think work well together with the more scientific way of doing things. So, and then finally, goal 6, a healthy, resilient community that takes action to address climate change. So those are the 6 goals, and again, the idea would be to structure the OCP around those, and I think within those goals there might be subsections where we might deal with specifics on transportation or land use or things like that, but the idea that those things are working towards that one common goal of that section. So finally, I just wanted to run over a couple of the highlights, I think, from the policy directions in the Key Directions report. And most of these are reflected in my staff report with a bit of a staff recommendation in terms of how to move forward with them. So I'll just provide some context about each of these policy directions and where they came from, what sort of the community feedback on them was, and and why they make sense as written. So again, I mentioned that one of the big issues I think that we heard from the community was this concern about building height in the downtown specifically. And based partially from that early initial feedback, some of the work done during the design charrette and elsewhere. The policy direction of maintaining the half blocks north and south of Beacon Avenue between 2nd Street and half block past 5th Street. So basically we're talking about roughly 5th Street east to the waterfront, north and south of Beacon Avenue. So the property's fronting onto Beacon Avenue. Limiting density and limiting building heights to a maximum of 3 stories. So where they front onto Beacon Avenue, you'd have a maximum 3-story cap there. From staff's perspective, we think this is a reasonable happy medium, I guess, between keeping things redevelopable rather than just freezing them in place and having the buildings, which, you know, some of those buildings are quite old already, having them sort of decline a little bit further, and sort of trying to hit the maintaining Sydney's character, I guess, or the seaside character, the mid-rise character of downtown that I think through the engagement process, I think we've seen that most people are comfortable with that level of building, that height of building. So 3 stories on Beacon. Another thing we have heard, and I think this maybe speaks towards the seaside character thing, is not a lot of love for some of the more modern building styles, especially at the ground floor where you have a large piece of plate glass, very modern materials. You know, I do think people really like that traditional building frontage with a slightly smaller window, you know, typically that you see on Beacon now with an independent business in. And, you know, that is certainly doable with a modern building. It's just a specific design choice. And so looking at beefing up the design guidelines in this area so that we can provide that type of building frontage. And again, it doesn't necessarily need to be a traditional building. It can be a more contemporary building, and you know, there's some good examples around the region of more contemporary buildings that do have that sort of very pedestrian-friendly, quote-unquote traditional frontage. So that would be the idea there, is to strike that balance between, you know, as these buildings age out, continuing to provide some level of redevelopment potential, but also through the use of design guidelines and height maximums, trying to maintain that, the small town feel, I guess, if you want to call it, of Sydney. Somewhat linked to that, you know, downtown policy direction as well is looking at improving public space in the downtown. So how can we make the streets more pedestrian friendly? Is there room for a public square in the downtown around the waterfront? We do have a lot of people moving into the downtown in the new residences that have been built in the past several years. And we have heard from some of them that, you know, public space is not overly abundant, and that doesn't necessarily mean a square or something like that. It could just mean more pedestrian-friendly street space, more benches, things like that. But looking at really trying to take a policy approach to encouraging those type of people-centered places in the downtown to happen. So that's another broad policy approach. The flip side of the first one, so thinking now east of 5th Street along Beacon mostly, but in that 5th Street to the Pat Bay Highway area is called here Downtown West, is because this area doesn't have that sort of fine-grained, traditional, walkable type of environment right now, looking at this area more as a slightly more, maybe modern's not the right word, but a slightly more focused area of density to support things like rapid bus, which BC Transit has, you know, indicated is coming to the peninsula, and you know, so if there's a rapid bus station around this area, we're concentrating growth in the downtown around this area so that, people can easily and quickly get to Rapid Bus or what have you. So moving away a little bit from the 3-story, smaller scale, fine-grained retail to a slightly more, 4-story, I guess we call it sort of a modern development approach, where the potential for a 5th story is entertained through discretionary approval by council. So the reason that's included in there is that I think, staff and the consultant have had some discussions about this, and the development community will invariably come forward with a proposal that exceeds 4 stories, what is permitted by zoning right now. The council of the day needs to decide what to do with that. I think staff are more comfortable with seeing a policy, some type of policy approach in the OCP with what to do with that type of application, providing some direction in terms of, it might be entertained if these conditions are met. So that's why the 5th story is in there, subject to discretionary approval. And again, here, looking at the design in terms of form and character of the buildings and design guidelines, to address some of the comments we've heard from the community about the materiality of the buildings that have been built recently in the downtown. So people would definitely like to see some more traditional materials, brick, wood, things like that on the buildings, and the design guidelines would be written with that in mind. So this is one of those issues that the community was a little more split on. As you can see on the slide, 53% of the community design survey respondents supported the idea of downtown west as a bit more of a growth area to support transit and other things like that in the community. So that's that. And finally, for the downtown, so outside of the areas discussed already, there is the idea of allowing some level of residential at the ground floor in the downtown, in the C1 downtown commercial area. This is something that I think, as a planner, my advice to the committee would be, this is something that I think the town should approach cautiously, and that typically things like industrial land, commercial land are very finite and can easily be overtaken by, the insatiable desire for residential development. And I think it may make sense in some areas that, we're probably, they're out of off the beaten path a little bit, or, they're just not great commercial areas. There might be some potential for ground floor residential, say townhouse style developments in the downtown. But I think, we should be very cautious in where that happens. I think, there's never going to be, in our lifetime, sort of an increase in the amount of commercial we can make with residential property prices being what they are. And so I think preserving the commercial land for commercial development is fairly important. So yeah, I think, planning staff is certainly open to the idea of some areas being residential at the ground floor, but I think more work is needed to be very selective about where that might happen. And we would bring forward some specifics in terms of areas that we think make sense in that regard. So there was support for downtown townhouse style development. I think certainly people like living in close proximity to the downtown because there's all the services there and you can just pop out your door and get that stuff, but we need to make sure that the services are there for the future as well. So there's, I think, a critical balance to be struck there, and we will look very closely at what that is going forward. Moving on to more broader residential matters. So policy direction of encouraging garden suites, secondary suites, and duplexes to be built throughout Sydney's residential neighborhoods. So generally here we're talking about Sydney's quote-unquote single-family neighborhoods, which really, I mean, most, probably 50% of single-family homes in Sydney have a secondary suite. There's a lot of duplexes in those neighborhoods as well. So very rarely is there a single-family home. But looking at providing the owners of those properties some additional options in terms of garden suites, which is a detached dwelling behind the house, and in what circumstances that might be reasonable, and what size would be a reasonable size, and things like that. Again, this is a policy direction, and the details would need to be worked out largely through the zoning bylaw process following the OCP. But again, looking at, we do have some areas in the town that where secondary suites are not permitted. And so I think there's a need to look at those areas where we know there's quite a few illegal secondary suites already. And we know there's also people who would like to do a legal secondary suite and provide themselves with income and affordable housing in the community. So looking at those areas and potentially expanding the area where a secondary suite can be built. Duplexes are also permitted in most of Sydney's single-family areas, provided that a minimum lot size is met. So I think there's a need to review that minimum lot size and see, are we providing enough duplex units as well? Maybe that needs to be adjusted. So this is, again, a broad policy approach, and then the details would need to be worked out. It is along the lines of what Sydney has been doing in the past. With the, garden suites we currently permit in just one section of the town, in the Orchard neighborhood. But all of these uses are permitted in the town. It's just under what circumstances they would be permitted would be reviewed, and we'd provide some policy guidance for how the zoning bylaw might be amended to change their permitted uses in the future. So that's one aspect of that. Develop forming character guidelines that regulate safety and privacy and enhance neighborhood character. So where you, for example, put in a garden suite, you don't want two garden suites next to each other with windows looking into each other's bedrooms, for example. You don't want probably a two-story garden suite looking down into someone's backyard. So coming up with very specific design guidelines that make sure that those community concerns are addressed in terms of privacy, adjacencies, things like that. And then finally, in this policy direction, allow townhomes and multiplexes, so 2 or 3 story walk-up, basically, to be built in appropriate locations near neighborhood commercial nodes, regulated again by forming character guidelines. So what this is essentially saying is where these neighborhood nodes are, the neighborhood commercial nodes are, and they're in the key directions report. I think it was page 11 off the top of my head. They're in pink. Around those areas, there would be some opportunity for increased townhouse development, density to essentially support those neighborhood commercial nodes. We haven't seen a lot of growth and development of the nodes themselves in the last couple of decades. Malaview and Rest Haven, for example, there's a fish and chips restaurant, a Thai restaurant, and a corner store there. Rest Haven store up at Rest Haven and Harbor Road. And these are all areas where there is actually already some townhouse development around them. And the idea would be to review that, and within a sort of a 5-minute walk area, provide the opportunity for some additional townhouse development. So again, sort of ground-oriented to potentially 3-story, but generally 2-story townhouse type of development. Also related to housing, there's a policy direction for staff to prepare an annual report on Sydney's housing needs. And the idea here, so we've got our housing needs assessment that we did in 2019. And going forward, an annual review would give us the opportunity to take a look at what's been built in the past year And for example, if we're getting all one type of development that's serving one demographic in the community, we can look at that, what do we need to shift in our zoning bylaw, in our other policy documents that would move the needle in favor of a broader type of housing provision in the community. If there's a specific need that's not being addressed, we could identify that and move that forward. So that would be a staff report, maybe early in the year annually, that would highlight what's been built and propose some policy direction changes if needed for review. Switching to transportation, so there's a policy direction about essentially enshrining in OCP policy the idea of the development of an active transportation network across the community. As I mentioned, we've seen a lot of support in the community engagement about support for active transportation and the expansion of active transportation facilities in the community. From, I think, a broad range of demographics. And the idea here would be to look at, on a very high level, putting a policy framework in place in the OCP that would support the development of the upcoming active transportation plan next year after the OCP is complete. So, that policy, or sorry, the network, the active transportation network, it may look like the picture shows here, a more of a separated bike lane type of thing. It may not. It may look like neighborhood greenways where you take a local street, add a bit of traffic calming and make it more comfortable for people to cycle on. So details would be figured out at the active transportation planning stage. But here we're looking at more high-level policy that will provide support for moving forward with some of those initiatives in the future. And finally, one of the policy directions to touch on is this idea of a bit of environmental restoration policy direction. So explore the feasibility of encouraging the redevelopment of older single detached home properties adjacent to portions of Mermaid Creek. So essentially running from Mermaid Park at the north end down to sort of the just north of the library at the south end. Between those 2 points, Mermaid Creek has been, over the last 80 years, put in a pipe. There are a few sections of it that are daylighted, and most of it's piped, though, underneath there. And there are some opportunities in there to consolidate properties, and if in the consolidated property there's a development that takes place at one side of that property, land can be freed up potentially to do some level of restoration for the creek, and something I think on a larger scale but somewhat analogous would be a lot of the Boker Creek restoration through Oak Bay and Saanich. And again, this is a very long-term initiative. It would probably take as long to repair the damage to even a small extent as it has taken to put the creek in a pipe. So you're probably talking a multi-decade effort here. Given the price of land in Sydney, purchasing property outright to do environmental restoration is probably cost prohibitive. And so this is one method by which the town could potentially look to free up that land and be able to do this type of environmental restoration. And there's some nice things in this bulleted list here that talk about, trail along the restored creek and things like that. Really, that's many, many, many years in the future. The key here is the land use pattern change, allowing some level of land above the piped creek to be freed up and eventually, potentially daylighted or something like that. Acknowledging there's some technical issues potentially with the riparian areas regulation and things like that would need to be dealt with. But in terms of an environmental restoration initiative, putting those land use regulations in place now that would allow some of that land to be freed up could set the stage for further restoration further down the road. So that's a direction in there. It did get a lot of support. 77% of people like the idea. Again, it's not an easy or quick initiative. It would be, again, multi-year, multi-decade likely. But as the saying goes, best time to plant a tree is yesterday or whatever. So it's something that could be started now through a land use management approach. So that's it for the main key directions I wanted to discuss. I'm happy to respond to questions about any of the other key directions. And so what's next? What I'm looking for from committee tonight, and hopefully council as well, is the next steps with the key directions report. So there are some recommendations in my staff report for how you might wish to consider moving forward with it. But yeah, looking at getting public feedback or feedback from advisory bodies and moving on with this document to phase 3 and incorporating some of the ideas in here into the draft plan. Again, acknowledging that none of this is set in stone. These are broader directions that the details might change on. So happy to take any questions if there are any. Or
Are there any questions from committee? Go ahead.
Thank you. Questions and comments, or?
Absolutely.
Okay. First of all, I just wanted to comment in regards to the engagement. I've had a couple comments from younger demographics, young moms with kids, and they just said how much they love the opportunity to be able to do online engagement and the OC Pizza Night, which I originally wasn't a fan of, but I've just heard such great things. And so I guess in terms of, moving forward with future engagement things, the comments that I heard was, I hope you continue to allow that online thing, that opportunity, whether it's for OCP or things in the future. And both moms said to me, it's so much easier to be able to do that. They don't have to worry about getting a babysitter or what they're going to do with their kids. They can go online for a designated period of time. So that was good. So just thought I'd pass that along.
I have to say in response to that the early days of the pandemic caused me a lot of stress in terms of what was going to happen with engagement. But I think, ironically, it actually made it easier for people to get involved. People were, I think, maybe looking for something to do as well.
Yeah.
And I've been pleasantly surprised by the level of engagement online throughout the process.
So I guess one sort of positive thing from the pandemic. Just a couple comments in regards, this is more to, I guess, in regards to regional context and overall context. And some things that I thought we might incorporate is, one thing I thought that we might have missed was the importance of Sydney as a marine hub. And so in our regional context, we talked about, where we fit with the other municipalities within the CRD. And I never thought a lot about it before until recently. Someone who I was speaking to in the marine sector who was quite involved. And he said, you guys are lucky. Sydney is the marine hub of the Pacific Northwest, especially for recreational sort of marine traffic. And so the comment made to me is that, that's something that we should be incorporating in our OCP. And also the fact that we have very limited spaces to accommodate marine businesses and industry. And I know that we do our best. We've identified Harbor Road as an area for that. But the thing that was pointed out to me was we should be thinking about our waterfront as well. And so, if you're lucky enough, I'm told, to have waterfront as we do, to maximize that and to use that more for marine purposes rather for other sorts of things. And so what comes to mind is, I know we've tossed around ideas about, moorage or facilities. So something like that. So I guess my comment is about making note of the fact that that's an asset. And I think that's something that, just like you said before, when you're talking about using commercial space for residential, you know, there's a limit. We want to have space to grow our commercial, so for our waterfront, same sort of thing. Also, I wondered in the context part of it, whether we had making reference to the impacts of the pandemic, and whether there are any things in particular that we might be looking at differently or changing. So for example, you know, in the document we talked about, in one of the goals, I forget which one, we talked about making space for larger format anchor retail tenants. And so what I wondered though is in this context, you know, with the pandemic, what we found is the retail sector has taken a big hit, more online shopping. And so do we really think there's going to be a market for large format retail? It is one point. So whether that's something we want to consider in our planning. And the other thing related to that is, as we talked about before, in terms of the seaside character of Sydney, and you know, those small collection of eclectic shops that are locally owned, and everybody knows your name, and you know, wanting to preserve that. And so I guess what I would be worried about is allowing too much of that large format, and then we're sort of digging a hole for those smaller businesses that are already trying to survive. And also we're destroying perhaps the thing that makes us so popular. So.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is the town doesn't have a lot of control over what individual businesses go in a building after it's built. So I think the idea there is to make sure that the initial land use regulations that allow a building to be built are, so you can easily divide up a piece of land into pieces that are so small that really you only get one type of tenant in there, right? Might be a small business or something like that. Or you can make the floor plate of the building such that it could accommodate a single large tenant, or it could be easily divided up to accommodate a number of smaller tenants. So I think the idea there is to make sure the land use regulations provide the flexibility for Sydney to be attractive to any type of business. And what I think you typically see in larger developments as well is, you know, and we're seeing this to an extent with the Cameo building across the street here, is that, you know, they've kind of got an anchor tenant, quote unquote, with the theater, and then two smaller units on the sides. And so when you get a bigger floor plate like that, you actually tend to get a range of uses in there rather than you know, just one single type. So I think the idea there is provide the opportunity for that, acknowledging that really in the end, all we can do is provide the space, the regulations that make the space a certain size, and it's the market that's going to fill up that space in the end. If, you know, if small retail continues to, say, take a hit due to pandemic related things, you know, there's nothing that the town is going to be able to do really in terms of you know, resurrecting them, right? The best we can do is provide you know, space that any business can take advantage of. And
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, just a comment on goal number 4 about diverse and balanced community supporting a thriving local economy. I still feel that one's problematic for me. Because I look at those as two very separate things. About diverse and balanced community, that's kind of one thought in terms of you know, having you know, more younger people, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And then thriving local economy, like, to me, I think there's a lot to be said for the economy. Everybody wants a thriving economy, of course, but you know, I think you know, I was looking to see some things there in terms of capitalizing again on our status as a marine hub? How do we position ourselves to build on that? How do we position ourselves to take advantage of the blue economy, the green economy? I think there's opportunity for us to position ourselves as an accessible community and tap into growing markets for accessible tourism, for example. So, yeah, just to comment on that, I just feeling like the economy could deserve a goal on its own.
Yeah, and keep in mind here too that this is just a goal. So,
Right.
Any number of policies or subsections under that goal could focus on specific areas, for example, that are economic related. I think the key here was to provide a link between, a broadly, a diverse demographic and a diverse community in town is going to lead to, I think, a diverse economic environment as well. So, as everybody knows, Sydney has a very retiree-focused demographic right now, and retirees are great. They're a great demographic of people, but retirees tend to do certain things. A broader demographic would give other businesses other opportunities to, thrive as well. And for example, younger people with kids like me, I might love to take my boat out on the weekend and, support the marine industry in that way. So I think here the idea is just as the intent of the goal being to link that broader demographic with the broader level of economic activity. And then, under that goal, we can delve into some of those specific topic areas for sure. I mean, your point's definitely taken, and I'm happy if you want to send me those thoughts offline.
Okay.
And, yeah.
I've got some other things, but I'll just pause and see if my
Okay.
colleagues would like to jump in.
Actually, I have a speakers list, Councillor Garnett, then Councillor Rentoul, then Councillor Fallon. And do I have anyone else? No. And then we'll come back. Okay, so Councillor Garnett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Newcomb, for your presentation. Appreciate it. I also want to commend you and staff for the multifaceted approach you took for engagement. I've seen a lot of surveys and stuff done in Sydney, and this was, as you said, it was one of the better ones. So congratulations to you guys for your efforts.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. One pertaining to expanding use in Sydney's residential neighborhoods. And you mentioned garden suites, and I don't know if this falls into the same category, but I was reading that the Kelowna Council had passed or is passing a zoning amendment that would allow for tiny homes on their single residential lots, provided they met a certain size, had concrete pads, sewer, and water hookups. So is that something that you looked at as a staff, or is that something that's feasible in our community, do you feel, or is that something that's out of base for us?
The tiny home thing is not something we've looked at specifically. I mean, I haven't looked at the Kelowna you mentioned. Yeah, I haven't looked at the Kelowna regulations. It sounds to me like they're just basically talking about garden suites and calling them tiny homes. If they're on a foundation and things like that, I mean, it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other almost. I think there's been a reluctance in most municipalities to look at tiny homes are essentially just RVs, and movable structures like that generally haven't been looked upon as something that's easy to zone for. So it's not something I think that we've looked at. The preference would definitely be for more of a fixed solution, like a garden suite. And I mean, you could have a tiny home moved onto a concrete foundation and probably meet the zoning parameters for a garden suite. So again, it's maybe just a different name for something that we have explored. I think maybe another issue there is a lot of places do minimum floor areas just to make sure that there's some level of livability there. And so a lot of those tiny homes probably don't meet that minimum floor area. They're quite small in terms of, you don't have a fixed bed or something like that. So the idea would definitely be to push things in a more permanent dwelling unit type of direction. rather than take that sort of tiny home approach.
Okay, thank you. Just one other question. With regards to the climate action report, part of this document,
Yep.
I'm assuming these numbers were probably the guesstimations and where we want to go would have been put in place before the announcement of the York Realty VAA Amazon development. So I'm wondering, in terms of 260 employees, 150 vans, it's going to increase GHG emissions for sure. Is that something we need to revisit in this in terms of targets and what we want to hit, given that those numbers are going to be higher probably than they were when they looked at doing this?
You know, I think probably the numbers would remain consistent because, as you'll see in the inventory there, most of Sydney's GHG emissions are from on-road transportation, 50% approximately. The targets in there are dependent on widespread adoption of electrification of a vehicle fleet, and that includes some level of delivery vehicles and things like that. So I think the expectation is that, and probably industry is going to move faster than, you know, the residential homeowners and their EVs. I'm not sure we could quantify that at any reasonable level with the data we have available. And B, I think from what I've seen of the Clean BC program that the province is moving forward with, I think there's an expectation that businesses of that type will adopt widespread fleet electrification. In terms of, you know, does that building use natural gas? I don't know about that, but at least from their on-road transportation emissions, you'd hope that they decline in concert with broader EV adoption across the province.
Yeah, I guess I see that part of it, but I guess I'm also concerned about the amount of employees potentially not living here but coming from somewhere else, and the constructs of that highway intersection waiting in a left turn lane for who knows how long with cars just running repeatedly. So I guess that part of it, because I know they had quantified that they would say within 5 years they will electrify their fleet, which is, you know, where people are going in that. But in terms of personal car use, and the wages and benefits that they're going to pay these kind of employees who may not be able to afford electric vehicles, you know, there's still that added push potentially. I'm just trying to think in terms of what could happen.
Yeah, and intra-regional transportation, like commuting basically, is another tricky one because I believe the methodology is they take the regional emissions from motor vehicles essentially and then divide them out on a per capita basis. So I don't think it would show up, you know, at the level of emissions inventory detail we have now. I don't think something like that would show up as a major blip on our emissions. It would be reflected more probably in overall regional emissions, if that's the case. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Rintoul?
Thank you, Chair. And thanks, Mr. Newcomb, for the presentation. My appreciation, as well as my colleagues have expressed to staff and to Modus for the processes that were developed to ensure engagement. And like others, I'm extremely impressed with the amount of feedback we've received. My question is just with respect to some of the within the slides in your presentation, but also within the report itself. There appear to be occasions where there's a statement made with respect to the level of support for a policy direction. So if I take your policy direction implementing a cycle network and sort of the policy direction that's identified there, referred to nearly 75% of OCP tonight workbook respondents supported prioritization of active transportation, and I'm curious, did that vary significantly from the survey responses on this issue? Was there a place where consolidated survey results were taken, or were you seeing discrepancies or differences in the types of feedback mediums that you received?
Yeah, I mean, some of these are definitely taken from specific engagement initiatives. I think probably just for the ease of displaying. and some of them I think are not quantifiable in this way. So for example, the feedback we got at the initial project launch event, where we did see a whole raft of comments supporting active transportation, for example, there was no sort of 100% there. We just collated those comments and, kind of added them up in terms of overall support for something. In this case, I think, certainly for active transportation, but I think more broadly for most of these, like with the themes that came out of engagement, the level of support for this stuff was pretty consistent across the different engagement activities, if that's answering your question. In some cases, it's not possible to say 75% as is shown on this slide. Maybe if you added up the comments from the project launch event, maybe it's, 60 or 80% or something like that in favor of moving forward with improved active transportation. But my general sense is that it's very consistent across the engagement activities.
Okay, no, that's helpful because I think the report does a great job of breaking down where we saw high areas of support. I just noted in a couple of places only one of the mediums was noted specifically, and I wanted to make sure that it was fairly being portrayed in terms of the results from each of the survey mediums, recognizing that well received and participated well, but the survey, online survey, certainly had the majority of participants. So I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Councillor Falla?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. I will echo my colleagues' congratulations to you and staff for the work and the responses that you were successful. So thank you for that. I have a question on page 12 of your slide, so goal 1, the regionally connected, vibrant downtown. So it says 53% of community design respondents. That's low.
Yeah.
And so I think there's still some hesitancy about looking at that kind of height and density in that area. And to that point where they're at the bottom where you're looking at design guidelines, et cetera, with that, and there was a previous slide about looking at what the shop fronts should be looking like and looking at using more natural materials. I think it's not just a case of natural materials. If I look back to the multifamily buildings that were built in the 80s and 90s, they're not terribly inspired architecturally. The difference there is they're set back from the street. They have a large property and a small footprint of their building. There's an incredible amount of greenery to soften the effects of people really don't notice. When I talk to people and they talk about the new buildings and they go boo, 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 and I said, so what about this building? And they said, I've never noticed it because it's softened. And I think, and I brought this up when we were talking a few years ago with when the fire hall building came up for discussion and design, and it's about greenery at our feet. It's great to have trees, but they're blooming way up there. They're great to look out of your condo or your office suite and you're looking at green, and I don't deny that. But I think if we're talking about pedestrians, if we're going to look at our character, regardless of whether it's seaside character or not, but a character for our community, I think we need to keep vegetation accessible. And I'm not even talking about a planter that is, again, raising it up off the ground. It needs to be down at, the ground needs to be softened. Mm-hmm. And the other day when I was walking past the new development on 4th and on the northwest corner of 4th and Beacon, and they happened to have the doorway open, and I could see where the building footprint was actually, and you look at the scaffolding and the protective, and it's right there at the sidewalk. And of course, many people are saying, oh, I hate what's going on there, but they're not seeing that the building is set back. I think there's a real man to moving a building away from right at the curb and giving the pedestrians a sense of space. regardless of whether you take metal and glass, if you then soften that impact and don't have the whole expanse. I happen to like modern architecture, but I also respect the rest of it, and I also like natural materials. So I think that's a big part of what we need to ensure, that we bring green throughout our town. And when we're talking about town square, I look at Beacon Park and see how well used it is. People who regularly go there and bring their morning coffee, whether they're purchasing it or they're bringing it in a thermos from home. That park is used greatly. It would be wonderful to have something a little further west in town to balance out a place to be, to hang out. Doesn't have to be the ocean view, it needs to be something else. So then I'm going to jump over to.
Councillor, before you move on, do you mind if I respond to those? Because there's
please,
two
yes.
points in there. Thank you, first of all, for the comment, because it really highlights that the Key Directions Report is not an all-encompassing, comprehensive document of OCP policy that is to come. And that is another thing we have heard quite clearly from the community, that more green space around some of the buildings is necessary. Now, I would highlight that in the downtown, where we want the storefronts next to the sidewalk for window shopping purposes or whatever, that's a different context, but definitely for the buildings in the sort of apartment residential areas, people have highlighted in the engagement process the fairly stark difference between some of the buildings that have been built in the last couple of years and the 80s and 90s buildings that do have larger setbacks. So that's something that will be brought forward into the draft. Ultimately, that's a zoning bylaw thing with setbacks, but there will be some policy that will address that for sure. One more thing I just wanted to highlight on this slide that's on screen here about the 53% you mentioned. Now, that question on the community design survey asked about support for building heights in excess of 4 stories. As you can see from the 53-47% split, there was a very mixed level of feedback on that. Based on that, the policy direction to keep things largely at 4 stories was put into the document. So,
Thank you for that, Mr.
Yeah.
Newcomb.
just wanted to clarify that.
No, I appreciate that. The other part goes to both the vision and goal number 1, and the wording is work hard to create a vibrant community. Are we not a vibrant community already? I would like to think we are, and if I'm going to wordsmith, I'm going to say something like maintain or enhance what we have.
Duly noted. Thank you. It's a good change.
Thank you. And the other part I also note is that you used the word housing unaffordability. And I think that's a real shift in thinking, because previously we've talked about housing affordability. Now you've gone to the lack of affordability. And I think that's an important shift. And that ties in with active transportation, public transit, all of those things. We need to, and I was speaking with Mr. Humble last week, we really need to address public transportation, because it's part of the affordability aspect, is to make sure that there is a good, and I know that's not part of the OCP, but it's part of our awareness of the piece of the puzzle that's missing in there. We need to ensure that it is there. So, and the seaside character, I'm just going to finish off with the seaside character because it is nebulous.
Take a crack at defining it for us, please. We'd love to hear it.
Councillor O'Keefe touched, well, she didn't touch on it, spoke to it when she was talking about enhancing and maintaining what we have. We have a waterfront, and I think that needs to be broadened. I'm going to suppose, I don't think people are necessarily thinking about a specific type of architecture in our buildings that is, indicative of seaside towns or something like this. Towns are different. But I think we do have a character to just expand on what we have. We don't have to reinvent the wheel of who Sydney is. We are something already. We just need to realize it.
Yeah, and perhaps along those lines and the lines of Councillor O'Keefe's comments, I think you think about some of those seaside towns in England, for example, and why are they seaside towns? Well, they're beside the ocean, but they also have a predominance of marine-oriented businesses, and so focusing on that sector just by its very nature will make you a seaside community, right? So there's something in that, I think, as well, and worth including in policy in the OCP.
Thank you very much, Mr. Newcomb.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, we seem to not be doing questions for staff anymore. This is more comments and discussion, which is reasonable, but we're going to have to at some point transition to providing direction. Councillor Duncan, you're next.
Oh, thank you. So just as I'm listening to my colleagues talk about the and trying to define what seaside character is, and then thinking about the Mermaid Creek restoration, and I really like what you've set out here in a very long time scale of how that could be restored by aggregating lots. And then I think about all of the rest of our seaside properties. Some of them are along, like Ray Creek is a park mostly, but there are houses that get pretty close along that property there. But mostly I would be thinking about along Tallista Park, the walkway there, and that would be the primary one. And then the properties on the other side of that park that we know are already running into issues when we have to talk about flood construction level. And so we know that in the same time frame we're talking about restoring that park, that a lot of our seaside infrastructure is not going to be able to be maintained. We scoped out what we're doing with Beacon Park and the walkway there from our discussions of the wharf, because it's too big to even talk about. It's too big to even talk about. We know that if we have to rebuild that wharf to last for 50 years, multi-decades, it will have to be really high because the sea level of storm surges will be high, which means that by definition, we know that that park and that walkway and all of that stuff needs to change as well. We know that Tallista Park, sometimes if we have a king tide and a storm surge, in 2012, I believe it was, ends up underwater. We know that those houses will have the same problem. And I don't know, and this is kind of a terrible question to ambush you with, sorry. At what point do we have to start saying maybe the same kind of change in land use plan has to be done in some of these areas we're looking at our flood construction level, that we have to start aggregating properties and moving them back and restoring ecosystems there, because that's really at this point the thing that's going to happen anyway. I'm sorry, Corey.
Broadly, I would say that the nature of waterfront properties in Sydney is such that that's not really possible. Generally, probably 80% of the properties, just off the top of my head, are not deep enough that you could realistically move the house so that it would make a difference. There are a couple of very deep properties here and there that, yes, you could do that. I think probably the long-term solution is shoreline protection in hopefully an environmentally sustainable way, combined with generally raising the height of the house that replaces the current house. And we've seen a bit of that happening, not shoreline specifically, but I mean, you can see in the Orchard neighborhood, there's a couple of new houses that are quite high. If you think about the White House on First Street, just south of Orchard, that house was built under flood construction level, and so it's been raised, and I mean, it already had quite a large seawall there. So I think, I'm not saying there's nothing that can be done, but we are somewhat limited in terms of those, especially smaller waterfront properties, and what can be done. And typically it would be done at a redevelopment stage. I don't think, tying this into Mermaid Creek somewhat, I don't think there's any opportunity there in the same way in terms of amalgamation and redevelopment. Especially on the waterfront, I would say we certainly don't want to increase the intensity of land uses in areas that are going to be at risk for the future. The Mermaid Creek idea is more actually moving those land uses further away from where the creek bed should be. And because of the geometric dimensions of most of the waterfront properties, that idea is not really analogous or possible. So it's more of a shelter-in-place idea for the waterfront, whereas with Mermaid Creek, it's the potential to move some land uses away from the water course is there. Does that answer your question somewhat?
I think so, somewhat. I guess I just see a big conflict between additional seawalls and the kind of protection we are talking about and the environmental restoration that people are looking for. We know that from, talking to Peninsula Streams and environmental groups that the reason our beaches are in bad shape that they are is that in the 1980s people were allowed to build seawalls far too far down. And it's the seawalls and the existence of those seawalls that prevents the beaches from being able to have sediments deposit properly. That is degrading those beaches. And so I fail to see how building even harder infrastructure is going to meet that need. It meets the need of protecting people's houses, but it will definitely make protecting the environment, it will be definitely a trade-off there. So I was kind of hoping that there was maybe some kind of a sweet spot we could hit there, but
Well, being that I'm a glass half full guy, I actually think that Sydney is, a lot of Sydney's houses on the waterfront are actually on, not large bluffs, but if you think of part of Roberts Bay, I mean, there is a very low part at the south end of Roberts Bay, but many of the houses at the north end of Roberts Bay are actually fairly removed from the waterfront, and it's a very rocky waterfront, so it's not going to be washed out in the same way. Houses along Lochside Drive are on the high side of the road, so not directly in harm's way. So there are a lot of, I think, positive aspects to Sydney's waterfront vulnerabilities. And there are definitely some places that need attention, but unlike a place like the Gorge, for example, where you have some houses that are very close to the water, and a meter sea level rise is going to have serious implications there. I think there are fewer places on the waterfront in Sydney like that, partially because it's quite an exposed waterfront comparatively to those places. So, yeah, I mean, there's no easy solutions at this point, but it's something that will, I think, be consistently building on our approach in many years ahead, and it's probably going to be a +1 every year where we learn something new and adapt to it. I think the critical point is the redevelopment phase, that's when something can be done. That's when the homeowner can recognize the risk and put money into mitigating the risk, and the municipality has the tools to make that happen. So again, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, thank you. That was good. Thank you.
Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mr. Newcomb, for excellent presentation and for summarizing the extremely robust engagement that has taken place and that colleagues have commented on in a positive way. It was great to see that this evening. I'd just like to touch on points and I'll just go through kind of your slides rather than the report. And I'll go back to the what we heard slide and come back to the maintaining seaside character. And I was very pleased to hear Councillor Fallett raise the green, surface green, and the importance of it in our community. And again, pleased to hear from yourself that there was significant feedback with regards to the importance of that and how that will be addressed going forward. I think the phrase here, and I realize you have to have short phrases in a slide like this, maintaining seaside character. There are large cities, Miami, Monaco, wherever, that are seaside as well. But Sydney is unique as a small town seaside, small seaside town character. And we're very unique. And if you start at the north end with CM Harbor as a working harbor, with a marina, a large Pacific Northwest marina in the Pacific Northwest. You have bird sanctuary in Roberts Bay. You have other shoreline and then another marina. We have a band shell, as was referred to, in a large waterfront park that does operate as a town square. We can have in excess of 1,000 people or more to the Canada Day celebrations, concerts, all sorts of functions within the town. We have Glass Beach, we have the fishing pier, we have transportation with the Sydney Anacortes Ferry Terminal. Then we have Tallista Park, another multi-activity park on the waterfront, and continues on with a walkway right down by the water to our southern border. So we definitely have a marine character, and I mentioned the working harbor, but also Harbor Road, the very active marine industry, marine service industry that's there. And I think these are the things we want to preserve. We want to preserve these parts of our character, taking into account the important points that Councillor Duncan has reminded us of in terms of sea level rise and infrastructure. The other comment I have on this page is the absence of the words culture and recreation. And I have to think that, I know it's important to our community. We provide in our budget each year approximately $1 million to organizations like the Mary Winspear Center, the museum, the Arts Council, the Shaw Center for the Salish Sea, that provide a remarkable aspect or a remarkable local culture to not only our own citizens but to residents on the peninsula beyond and visitors. And I think it's important that we maintain and enhance the culture and recreation opportunities that we have. And I also noted within the vision that the word culture is not in the vision. Under goal 1, the policy direction, it says maintain the half blocks north and south of Beacon Avenue between 2nd Street and a half block past 5th Street. So we can see that on the map that's provided. It shows it's shown as item or area A, if you will. But there's two things that wind up coming out of this policy direction. One is with regards to the height, and so we see in area A and area C and area D references to different heights, and we appreciate the explanation there. But the other outcome is that when you get to the policy direction that speaks to ground floor residential use, you're in essence speaking outside of all of the area of A and C. And that's actually a significant portion of the downtown. Now, I do note both in your report and in your remarks this evening how we would want to be careful in terms of the area of ground floor residential, and it actually makes a reference to the periphery, starting perhaps at the periphery of the town, which would be maybe one side of Bevan or one side of Sydney Avenue. But I just note that it's just because it's actually these areas are addressing two things. One is they're addressing height, and one they're addressing use. And as it's worded, it shows the possible impact of a large part of the downtown having ground floor residential uses. And as indicated in the report, I would want to be careful about that. Under goal 1, or the policy direction under goal 1, regionally connected, vibrant downtown, the slides aren't numbered. The second paragraph says a 5th story may be permitted only in this area via discretionary approval, rezoning or variance application, where substantial public amenity is proposed. Example, social housing. I might want to suggest that be the only public amenity, because we know how important housing needs are within our community. And if we're indicating that area of the town is suitable to higher densities, the most important amenity I think we can receive for that is affordable housing or social housing to some extent. And that kind of takes it to, in effect, having housing policy, within the OCP. And I realize we have a housing needs assessment and housing policy will, come forward to a certain degree, but it's just a comment, for consideration that I think that is perhaps the more important of the amenities to be proposed. There are certainly other amenities that we have received, and there are times when we've received a substantial cash amenity, which does go into a housing, needs fund and so on. But that's my comment on that slide. The next slide, policy directions. Areas of downtown outside downtown west and downtown east will be limited in scale to 4 stories. In the report, it only refers to area D. So there's no reference made specifically in the key directions report to the heights in area B. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, largely that's because most of Area B is already developed. So that's the area with the Pier Hotel, the Landmark building. The shops at Port Sydney is not a new development, but it's under a height covenant. On the other side, I guess it would be sort of the Fairway property there, and maybe behind the Sydney Cannery building would be really the 2 properties in that area that haven't redeveloped. They would just be subject to the 4-story limit that's talked about here and is currently in the zoning.
So if I look at the Beacon Avenue...
Sorry, except for the properties on Beacon, which would be subject to the 3-story limit.
Okay,
being discussed.
But again, when you talk about when you talk about Sydney East or downtown East, you start at 2nd Avenue, which omits that area that is actually the same, down to Fairway, or the Landmark building is not likely to change anytime soon.
Yeah.
But it does have small business operating from those units. So I just question, starting at 2nd on Beacon Avenue.
Yeah, and acknowledged fully that, for example, on the south side of Beacon Avenue, A could extend into B to provide that 3-story policy guidance into that area that has yet to redevelop. Again, I would say these are broader policy directions that do need to be refined somewhat further, and so more definite approaches will be brought forward for the draft OCP.
Oh, that's great, thank you.
Yep.
And just, this is actually coming out of the staff recommendations, that staff bring forward a detailed height allowance map in the draft OCP based on the recommendations in the key directions report. Would that be for all of areas A, B, C, and D?
Generally the downtown
Yeah,
the whole downtown.
Okay.
We do have a map like that in the current downtown local area plan. I think from planning staff's perspective, it's not quite as detailed as it could be in that it, where we would have liked to maybe push back a little harder on heights, it hasn't provided that support because of its lack of detail. So we'd be looking to address that in the new OCP.
I just have 2 others, and the one is I think it's the next slide, goal 3. A policy direction. The first sentence is the reference to garden suites, secondary suites, and duplexes. But then the next sentence is allow townhomes and multiplexes. And I really think that's a separate policy direction. I understand it's part of land use and housing. But I think it's a unique policy direction. And one of my comment with regards to allowing townhomes and multiplexes in this concept of 5-minute walkable neighborhoods. Sydney is very walkable throughout. And when you look at the map it's on page 15 of the Key Directions report itself, and it's a map of all of Sydney, and it has in pink or in red neighborhood commercial nodes, if you will. That's the language used in the report. But some of them are pretty, some of them are actually no longer. I'm looking at East Shore Village on Bowerbank, near Ardwell, or at, that pink spot is actually at Calvin and Bowerbank. There is no commercial there now. I mean, that property was formerly commercial.
Yeah.
But
No, the idea there would be to establish a new one, maybe across the street or something like that. So in an area of, somewhat higher density where there is townhouse development or walk-ups like that, potentially they could walk up to Rest Haven store, but is there the potential for something more close by? Perhaps there is.
okay, so I read the report, and forgive me that it would be placing duplexes and townhomes near these nodes, not necessarily placing new nodes near existing townhomes and multiplexes, but I get where you're coming from.
In that case, a lot of that stretch of Bowerbank is either already townhouses or already designated for townhouses. So that may not change, the designation, but, and again, more policy work needs to take place in terms of where is the appropriate, that's not something we've delved into in detail yet, where are the appropriate locations for new neighborhood commercial nodes, if any. That's something that, we'll probably look at in the next couple of months, just as we start developing the mapping for the project and whatnot. But I guess the idea is where there are pockets of density or existing neighborhood commercial, I guess it's two sides of the same coin.
My final comment in this area is really that, looking at some of these nodes, I mean, for example, there's a restaurant on Kenora Road.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, that's the only commercial use there. Down the way, there's a gas station and something else.
Yep.
But to suggest that, because there's a restaurant there, that we would then consider it appropriate to have adjacent to that or in the very near area, multiplexes and townhomes, I don't get that. I think the way Sydney has evolved and the way we would want to go forward is we would just want to look at our town and say what are the opportunity areas, taking into account where commercial may be or may not be, but to tie it directly to single use, some of these commercial nodes, I think is.
Again, I would just stress that these are not specific land use decisions and even close to that. They're broad policy directions. The map here is actually developed out of the design charrette and was more of a conceptual, let's discuss the potential type of map. And so the idea is, as we go into drafting the OCP, doing detailing mapping work, looking at, potential areas where, some townhouses can support neighborhood commercial. Maybe there's a bit of vice versa there, where we can do a neighborhood commercial that could be supported by existing townhouses. Those are, very detailed policy proposals that would come forward with the draft and would need to go through an extensive process at that time. So this is just the bigger picture of, is this broad policy direction generally supportable, and specifics are going to come as we develop the draft. Yeah.
Thank you. My last comment is the next slide, and the policy direction. Town planning staff will prepare an annual report on the progress, and you expanded on that a little bit. My preference would be not to wait until the OCP is finished and then beyond that to see a first report. If I could just leave it with staff for consideration of what the earliest opportunity. I'm not suggesting within a month, the next month, or the next 6 months, but staff give it consideration, because I think it would be helpful to have such a report today. It would be helpful having such a report going into drafting the OCP. But we do have the housing needs report, so there's an awful lot of information already contained there.
Yeah.
But just a thought on the implementation of that specific policy.
We do have on our to-do list a report out on the blanking on the name of it. Councillor Garnett, I believe it was you that brought the idea forward of the rental assistance policy. So we will be reporting out on that later this year, and potentially might not be a fulsome report on housing needs, but potentially we could incorporate some more recent data into that report as well, just to provide a bit of an overview. So we'll look at doing that.
Sorry, I do have one more area, and it was the next slide. And it was as part of the upcoming active transportation plan process, the town will prioritize creating a cycling network, and we appreciate the information in the report and your presentation of it. A comment I have is that sidewalks, paths, trails, people rolling now, not just on bicycles, is very important to active transportation as well, and that I wouldn't that hopefully there will be policy at some policy level addressing the importance of that in our community as well, appreciating that a cycling network is something new to our community, but I think there may be opportunities, and our council and staff this term have directed attention to pathways. We're redoing the one in West Side, but I think there are others, and also included in our Parks Master Plan. So just a comment there.
Duly noted.
Thank you, staff. I might, if I might, Chair, go to the staff recommendations and make a comment, or did you wish to?
Actually, I was going to,
You go.
as Chair just commented, it's 7:45 now. I think staff are getting a lot of valuable input from council, generally from the comments and discussion we're having, but I'm also sensitive to, there are quite a few recommendations in the staff report that we're going to have to deal with, and if we're going to take as long going through those as the as we have with the PowerPoint, maybe we had better get to it. But I had Councillor O'Keefe waiting with some additional questions. So shall we get those questions out of the way and then move on to the recommendations?
Okay, just a couple things. I was just wondering whether you had any feedback, or whether it's contained somewhere, about having greater diversity of independent living arrangements. So I like that there's going to be garden suites and secondary suites, but I was thinking about arrangements that would allow multi-generational families living in one home, or and what that usually means is having a second kitchen. And so whether that's something that is doable without having to go through having a full secondary suite sort of thing, whether you heard that, whether that's a policy sort of thing we might consider.
Well, I mean, broadly, I think most municipalities still have zoning bylaws and OCPs that are built around this idea of the single-family home. And a lot of the intensity of land uses on properties are built around that idea, using that as sort of the basis for limiting. So you've got a single-family home, and then you can sort of add in a secondary suite, through a permitting process to add that second kitchen, or a garden suite, or you could potentially redevelop to a duplex. Some municipalities have what's called a form-based code, and that can be either in an OCP or a zoning bylaw combination, where you have the form of the building, and then what takes place inside that, is sort of up to the developer almost. So you've got what's the size of a large single-family house, and there might be 4 smaller units in there, or maybe it's 1 big unit, or maybe it's 6 very small units. So some municipalities are moving in that direction too, where it's less about regulating, it's more about regulating a shape that fits into the community, and less about regulating what happens inside that shape. I think maybe move a little bit in that direction, where it does provide a little more flexibility, so that if what the market is screaming for is smaller units that are affordable, there's at least some mechanism to deliver that without a very lengthy permitting process or rezoning process or something like that. Maybe that's where the you know, the additional uses like garden suite or secondary suites in more circumstances is going, in that with just a building permit, you can add those uses to your property without having to go through sort of a rezoning process or something like that. So we're inching toward that flexibility, maybe not quite to the dramatic sense of the form-based code idea, but, you know, somewhat getting there in that it's easier to do a variety of things and still keep within the neighborhood character that I think people would expect. Does that
Okay.
answer your question somewhat?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it at that. I'll consent question and
Sure.
comments.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I did have one question for staff, and it's about really sort of process and timelines for things, but mostly process. So we've got the key directions report, and this is the, I guess there's a question sort of, is this a draft report or is this a final report? And I know we're referring it to the public for comment, and we're proposing, the suggestion is that we're referring it to the public for comment and a couple of our advisory committees as well for review and comment. But I guess the question is, are we expecting the possibility that this report will get revised? Or is it a final report, and rather you're asking, we're looking for input on where we go from there?
So the answer to that is the latter. We've just finished a year of asking people what they think about a variety of things. And the idea would be now, you know, here's what we've heard. Here's some of the directions that have come out of that. And, you know, do you have any final comments, essentially? You know, and we're more than willing to hear all those comments. And I think if there are, you know, important new comments or information that comes out of a process following this, we would come back to council and say, you know, we've heard something maybe unexpected. I feel like at this point, a lot of people who wanted to say something about the OCP process and provide their input feel they've had the opportunity to do so. And now I think staff's preference would be to move forward with the drafting process with the key directions report as is, or with any, you know, feedback that this committee or council will provide. And as well, any of the advisory committees and the public that you wish to refer it to, and try and incorporate those comments into the process of drafting the OCP. Now, of course, yeah, like I said, if we hear something that's drastically different than what we've heard in the past year, we might need to come back to council and ask, you know, what should we do with this comment or something like that. But the intent here is the latter, which is take this largely as is and move forward to the drafting process.
Thank you. So you know, for clarity then, what we're really doing is we're asking people to comment on how the information and ideas in this report should get brought forward into the bylaw. Then my follow-up question is about the draft bylaw. Is council going to see that as a draft presented maybe at committee of whole, or is the first time we're going to see it when the bylaw is introduced for first reading?
It would be as a draft.
Okay.
Presented at committee of the whole
Thank
for
you.
discussion, yeah.
That was everything I was looking for. So now, Mayor McNeil-Smith, you were going to make some recommendations?
Thank you, Chair. And I guess I'll start with a question from staff. The first part, or the first recommendation says that the key directions report and the following specific policy directions be proposed for inclusion into the draft OCP as it's developed. I know I understand what the process is going to be, but in terms of reading that literally, the key directions report has many more policy directions than we discussed, than you presented and we discussed this evening. And so council is actually resolving to have all of the policy directions in the key directions report be forwarded for inclusion into the draft OCP as it's developed.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think the idea here was that, as I've done in the presentation, the specific policy directions that I've noted here in the report are just, I think, policy directions that are worthy of maybe closer scrutiny from the committee and council, and acknowledging that, you know, these have been discussed and we're okay as staff to move forward with them. For example, the residential uses at the ground floor in the downtown. I think Modus, the consultant, is a little more enthusiastic about that use being more broadly spread throughout the downtown, whereas I think staff are a little more cautious and we'd like to see that happen in more specific or limited places. And, you know, I think so that's an approach that staff would sort of like confirm from the committee and then ultimately council as we move forward with the draft. So they're just sort of highlighting those items. Other policy directions in the key directions report, I think staff are generally comfortable with, and, you know, unless there's something that committee would like to highlight, we would move forward with those as is.
Okay, I would just want it to be clear in our resolution that, you know, we are forwarding all of the policy directions, even though we haven't taken the time to discuss them all this evening. I'm going to propose a slightly amended first part, and that is that the key directions report and policy directions and its policy directions be referred for inclusion into the draft OCP as it's developed.
Second.
Okay, so that's moved and seconded. Did you want to speak to that?
I think we just need to, you know, to be clear that we're receiving and referring the entire key directions report and all of the policy directions for referring it to the draft OCP as it's developed, appreciating that we are going to, in later motions, likely referring it to other advisory groups for comment.
Okay, and just for clarity then, the motion would not have the specific A, B, C, D.
It would not have the specific.
Policies.
I'll have another motion to introduce, and if I might suggest at this point, Chair, that I would actually move A, B, C separately with.
Okay. So we have the motion in front of us. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call a question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried unanimously.
Okay, so I'd like to move A as a separate motion that staff bring forward a detailed height allowance map in the draft OCP based on the recommendations in the key directions report. I appreciate that the recommendation continues on to try and summarize the various heights in various areas of the downtown, but I think the key directions report speaks fully to that and would just leave it at the end of key directions report.
Okay. Is there a seconder?
Second.
Okay, that's seconded. Councillor O'Keefe?
So just a question, so you're,
Your mic.
oh, sorry. Thanks. So you're ending it right at there. Were you going to be including the last bit where it says where a significant public amenity is proposed?
I think it's spoken to well in the key
Okay.
directions report itself,
Okay,
and we had some discussion.
okay, that's fine.
Okay. Councillor Garnet?
Sorry to try and not be confused here. I just want to, maybe I didn't want to make a comment, I just want to ask questions of staff, but I do have reservations about anything more than 3 stories along Beacon Avenue. Particularly, I've heard about that from the community quite a bit. And I was trying to think about what it would look like in our community as you turn and drive in. And I want to be distinct as a community. I don't want to say seaside character, but I like distinct community, distinct character. And I feel like if we have 4 and 5 story buildings, potentially 5-story buildings, potentially along both sides of the street, we become like we're looking like any other overbuilt community. And that worries me because I think having to get to 5th Street to see that amazing stretch we have to the ocean might get lost on people before they even get there. So I just really have concerns about getting to that. I understand the rationale for doing it, but I'm just not sure if that's the direction that I want our community to look like as you first drive it or enter our community. It doesn't doesn't reflect our community for me. So that's just something I want to put out there as a reservation I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor O'Keefe?
Just a question. So my understanding is that when this would be brought forward, it's a draft. And so if once we see it, that we're not happy with it, we can still change it. Okay.
And if I could, the motion is to bring forward a height map. And I think that for the purposes of public comment and such, actually seeing a map of the heights for the downtown is probably going to be clearer to the public than having to wade through all the various policies. So I think the motion is a good motion, whether it gets supported at the end of the day or not. Further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call a question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried.
Thank you, Chair. And under B, that a policy supporting ground floor residential uses in Sydney's downtown be included in the draft OCP, but with limitations on its location and overall extent so as not to become a significant use in the downtown area.
Okay, so that's moved. Is there a second? That's seconded by Councillor Rentoul. Discussion?
I think that addresses, that wording addresses some of the comment that we heard from committee.
Councillor O'Keefe?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm going to vote against this one. I'm not keen to, I don't know that we've heard it from too many people in the public that that's something they want. It sounds like it's something the consultant thinks it's a good idea. But I agree with staff's concern about using our limited downtown commercial space. And even though I know it says limitations, I'm just afraid of the potential for it to morph into something that we don't like. So I prefer to leave it as it is. So I won't support this one for that reason.
Councillor Fallon?
Thank you. Just a quick comment on that one. If we're looking at live-work, then we still have the option. I know that there was discussion about different types of units, but if we're looking at live-work, then the option still is for it to be commercial space, solely commercial space. It's not all townhouses, it's not all residential. Is that correct? So on the policy supporting ground floor residential uses, was that was also looking at live-work? Or was it strictly residential?
To my recollection, this was specifically about a townhouse-style unit.
Okay.
As you're aware, council has, in the past few years, approved a few live-work units in the downtown. Actually, some of them are occupied now, and they're being used exactly as they were intended, so it's kind of nice to see. There's a small software company in one, and the gentleman lives there as well, I think, and it's actually kind of neat to see happen in the downtown. But I think the idea here is that this idea is based in the fact that there's a gap between the commercial usability of a site now and the residential usability of a site now. So you can easily sell condos in anywhere near Sydney's downtown right now. It's not so easy to occupy commercial space in a location that's maybe a little bit off the beaten track from a commercial perspective, but is right in the mix of things from a residential perspective. And so I think there's, acknowledging that there are some areas that are just not commercially viable in the present time. And then the question is, well, what to do if there's a 20-year gap between the commercial viability of a space now that's not, on a well-trodden path, say on the periphery of Sydney's downtown, but there's a development proposal. Should there be commercial space at the ground floor there that I'm not sure how it would be used. In one case, it's sort of sat empty, one case that I can think of. And, I think the idea with this with this policy approach is find the locations where probably that commercial space will never be extremely viable, and allow a couple of townhouse locations in and around the downtown, and hopefully push the commercial use that might have gone there into more concentrated areas, and make that other the areas where it is more viable in the present, essentially force those areas to be commercial when they redevelop, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Newcomb. That's helpful for me. I was concerned that if this is sort of taking that away, but that explains it, so I can support this.
Mayor McNeil-Smith?
Sorry, I had a comment, but I'll leave it for now. Thank you.
Okay, so we have the motion on the floor. Any further discussion? I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? There's one opposed, so that carries. Continuing.
The recommendation under C, that expanded opportunities for garden suites, secondary suites, and duplexes be broadly supported in Sydney's single-family residential neighborhoods.
Second.
So that's moved and seconded. Discussion? Seeing none, I'll just make a comment to staff that I anticipate some real pushback from some areas about duplexes. So for example, Summergate Village is likely to go ballistic at the suggestion of duplexes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have covered the topic of Summergate Village previously. There is no intent land uses into Summergate Village. We have had some discussions with them. Their strata has changed throughout this process, but the last discussions we've had from them, and I think not just the strata, but their membership made quite clear that they're not interested in seeing any new uses in Summergate Village. They're potentially open to the idea of what's permitted in the R4 zone in the zoning bylaw, which would be, stick-built cottages. But that's essentially, from a use perspective, the same thing as the manufactured homes that are in there now. But in terms of secondary suite, I don't think that's even possible, given the size of the lots in there. And a duplex is just not something I think we'd consider for a development like that. So Summergate, I would say, is separate from, and it right now it is dealt with separately in the current OCP as a separate land use. So yeah, there's no intent to include this into Summergate Village.
Okay, thank you. Mayor McNeil-Smith?
If I could just add to Chair Wainwright's a comment, I think there will be some reaction on this. And for example, had the opportunity to look at the zoning map today, and we actually have very limited area in Sydney as only single-family residential. The majority of where we have single-family residential is actually zones, the single-family residential and duplex. And of course, it has to meet certain requirements to actually be duplex. It doesn't mean a duplex can go everywhere. But for example, on that zoning map, the only purely single-family residential, as I recall, or is in this part of West Sydney, is along Ray Creek, on either side of Ray Creek. And to me, when that decision was made, it was probably made for environmentally sensitive reasons. And so this is a broadly supported statement, but I think there are going to be specifics, in different parts, whether it's Summergate, whether it's Creek, whether it's Beaufort Road, I don't know, that will arise as this work is done.
Yeah, if I might just comment on that really quickly. It's interesting because you're correct in that around some of the environmentally sensitive areas, single family with secondary suites, I should add, the R1.1 zone does allow secondary suites. Single family was maintained as a way to reduce the impacts on those environmentally sensitive areas. So a single family home with a duplex is 2 units basically. Duplex is also 2 units because you can't have secondary suites in duplexes. However, the rear setback for a duplex is much larger than a single family home. So what's actually happened is the duplex lots have had these large setbacks required. So along, for example, Mermaid Creek, there's been a duplex that's gone in there. Right next is a single-family home, and it's got a much smaller setback, and it's much closer to the creek. So the intent of those land use regulations didn't hold as well over time as we would have hoped. Now, there are two areas in town, the Beaufort Peninsula and out on Roberts Bay toward the end there, where only single-family homes are allowed without secondary suites at all. And I think what we've seen there is just, there's people who live there who would like a secondary suite for aging in place purposes or something, or there's a lot of illegal suites out there where, there is no opportunity without a rezoning to legalize them. So those are some things we'd be looking at along the lines of this policy direction.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, so we have the motion in front of us. No further discussion. Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Continuing.
I'm following the question or comment I provided in the response from Mr. Newcomb. I'm still a little concerned with the wording under D. I'll read it as it's proposed, that opportunities for townhouse and multiplex developments be supported within a 5-minute walkable neighborhood distance of neighborhood commercial nodes within what are currently Sydney's single-family residential neighborhoods. I'll move it, but I'll make some comments if it's seconded.
Do we have a seconder?
I'll second for discussion.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Go ahead.
Just to provide a little context, similar to the building height map and the rest of the draft OCP policy, the OCP will also include a land use map. And so there would be opportunity at the draft stage to look at exactly what land use changes might be taking place and to what extent and in what locations around these neighborhood nodes. So council would have the opportunity definitely to review those in detail.
And Mayor McNeil.
Yeah, I guess my challenge with this is the 5 minutes, and in the report it says walkable neighborhood, and just the walkability of Sydney. I just, but I'm going to leave it, and if colleagues have comment or amendments, we'll look to those.
Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. Yeah, I share concerns about this as well, because it seems, vague and unclear as to exactly where these would be, and how we figure out the 5-minute neighborhood distance. Anyways, I have some comfort in Mr. Newcomb's comments that there would be at least a draft of a land use policy. So I guess I'd be prepared to make a leap of faith and wait till I see a map, and thanks.
Mr. New.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The 5-minute neighborhood is a bit of a planning jargon, I guess. It's a principle where I think, as the committee probably knows, you've got a range of amenities within a certain walkable area. Is that distance 200 meters, 400 meters? It gets more complicated when you're doing the mapping because of the road network. So you can't just draw a circle around a neighborhood node and say, here's the 5-minute neighborhood. I mean, I think it's a process of looking at the map and doing the planning process to determine, what locations make sense. There's other issues to consider, like residential adjacencies. So how do townhouses work with single-family homes next door, for example? There's a whole bunch of other things to consider, and I think you need to go through a detailed mapping process to really work that stuff out. So that's the process that would be happening in the next few months.
Councillor Rinto.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'm inclined to not support this item. It seems, it remains to be somewhat unclear to me. It also perhaps seems somewhat ambitious, which isn't a bad thing, but it's a 10-year planning document in a perfect world before it's reviewed and addressed. And I feel some concern around some of the elements in here, and including multiplex developments and the reference to multiplex developments. So, oddly, if it had been somewhat clearer and we were talking about townhouse developments, I'd probably be more supportive of it than I am at the moment. So I'll leave my comments there, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Duncan?
Thank you. I'm quite supportive of this. I picture, when I think of the multiplexes, I picture kind of the older, like mansion conversions that you see around the Crystal Pool area, and they've been converted to, like there's still, it used to be a very big building, but now it's kind of, got 4 apartments in it. And that kind of, I can kind of see that kind of multiple apartments, but it's in a building that's not really quite an apartment building. And if we kind of get that mix, I think that would be nice. I'd almost end this sentence, with, instead of within what are currently Sydney's single-family residential neighborhoods, just simply outside the downtown core. And then that kind of brings into focus that we already have commercial nodes like Harbor Road that people don't really think of having, if we can diversify those services, or around, the Queen's Grocery and Highlands Fish and Chips, that we can kind of actually build these so that they would be more of the walkable neighborhood. And we really hyper focus on having commercial uses, that commercial uses are confined to downtown, and they aren't currently. And that just kind of brings it into focus that we do have more opportunity to build those services outside the core for better walkability in our active transportation network.
Mr. Newcomb?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to point out that currently in the OCP, and I think this would be carried forward to a large degree in the new OCP, we don't actually distinguish in detail between building types when we're talking about multifamily. So you've probably recall from the land use map in the current OCP that we just designate areas Res 3 multifamily residential. It's actually the zoning bylaw that provides the permissions on the ground to allow people to do, either townhouse developments or apartment developments. Our current zoning makeup, the RM5, RM6, and RM7 zones, basically allows already either a townhouse, multiplex, or apartment style of building, and then we set the density for that building, and they need to meet the design guidelines. So we don't actually, again, this is a broad direction, and the zoning, it's the zoning bylaw actually that would distinguish between those uses. And if council felt uncomfortable, for example, around a multiplex type of use, you would obviously have the ability to review the zoning bylaw when it comes forward following the OCP that would put that use into practice. What the OCP is going to do is say essentially, okay, here's an area where we're going to expect some level of multifamily development, and if that property is currently zoned as single family, for example, council is going to need to set parameters in the zoning bylaw for those properties before anything can happen there. And if that's not done through an internal process, a developer would need to come forward with a development proposal and say, hey, do you like this? Please rezone the land. So again, this is very broad. I would not get too hung up on multiplex versus townhouse. I would say, generally speaking, is some level of multifamily development around these neighborhood nodes an acceptable direction to move in? Would be the question I would pose, the way I would rephrase it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mayor McNeil-Smith?
Thank you. I still have concern in terms of the connection. I appreciate and I'm willing to support consideration and planning's consideration of townhouse and multiplex developments in currently Sydney's single-family residential neighborhoods, because various factors will be considered. The key directions report tries to tie it to commercial nodes, existing commercial nodes, and then staff made the comment, Mr. Newcomb made the comment that there may even be consideration of where future commercial nodes might be appropriate. Did I understand, and I guess the concern is around that what is a convenience store today may not be a convenience store. So if you go ahead and build, some multiplexes beside it or some townhomes beside it, and then it undergoes redevelopment, even if it requires a rezoning. The gas station, is it going to be a gas station forever? You know, these uses change, and they've changed in our community in the last 20 years. So my concern is over tying it to that. Mr. Newcomb, you spoke to, through the chair, Mr. Newcomb, you spoke to a map providing a map, and so this map would provide possible locations for townhouses, multiplex, and future commercial nodes?
Yeah, through the chair, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that question. So the work we've done to date has not actually focused on, we haven't looked in detail at the potential location of a new neighborhood commercial node. I think the idea in the key directions report is largely around the idea of supporting commercial nodes with some level of multifamily development. So, you know, there's a slightly higher density near these nodes. People can pop out of their front door of their townhouse and grab their morning coffee or what have you, without having to go to downtown Sydney or something like that. In the background and recommendations report, if you recall, there was a series of heat maps where the consultants used a GIS system to map density against a number of different factors. And so I think moving towards the draft, we'll be referencing those maps, looking at the potential for where, I mean, not just for neighborhood commercial, but we're looking at the potential for any land use change and what makes sense, and that'll come forward with the draft. So I understand what you're saying about, maybe the question is, are we setting up for a new neighborhood commercial node? That if there is one proposed out of the draft, it will come forward with the draft, and my expectation is, based on this map that the consultant's done, is that it will likely be located around an area of existing multifamily. And I think the broader point here is that the not intending to create sort of a pocket of new multifamily in a random spot in single-family neighborhood. I think the idea here is a little bit of incremental density around an established area that would help support a neighborhood commercial node. Broadly, that's the idea.
Yeah. So the first recommendation, or one of the earlier recommendations we made, was that staff bring forward a detailed height allowance map in the draft OCP. So there will be that for that height allowance in the downtown. Would there be is it proposed then that it would just be policy, or there would be a map, the townhouses, duplexes, and commercial nodes in the draft OCP?
Yeah, sorry. To be very clear, so like the current OCP, the new OCP will have a land use map, and the land use map identifies where you could do a use. And for example, if there was an area that's screaming out for a new neighborhood commercial node, there's people in that area who would love to be able to, within a 5-minute walk, go grab a coffee in the morning or something like that, and it made sense. The OCP land use map would propose that as a location for that to happen. That doesn't mean it's happening on the ground. That can only happen through the zoning bylaw and then a subsequent development. So all the land uses that will be included in the OCP will be reflected on that land use map. Residential, commercial, industrial, marine industrial, neighborhood commercial, all of those. And the locations and designations for basically every property in Sydney will be shown on that map, and council will have an opportunity to review that in detail.
So appreciating we do have the motion on that I read on the floor, but from this discussion, I'm feeling more comfortable with a recommendation along the lines, and I'm not proposing an amendment. We'll let this motion pass or fail. But a motion along the lines that staff bring forward a map in the draft OCP referring to duplexes, multiplexes, and commercial nodes in single-family areas in Sydney.
through the chair, that will happen anyway.
No, I realize that, but again, I'm just, again, this is going to go to OCP or different committees in the public, and I think the language and interpretation, you know, if we can, you know, through our discussion be more clear in intent is helpful, but I'll leave my comments there, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Newcomb.
I appreciate Councillor O'Keefe's next, but I'm just thinking in terms of expediency here. I'm not really, or I'm hearing generally, and I may be misreading the will of committee, willingness to see the specific proposal brought forward in, you know, for council to look at. And I'm also seeing quite a bit of discomfort with broadly worded policy. And I guess I'm wondering, if we did not make this recommendation, if there was no motion, what I'm hearing is likely we would still see this brought forward. After all, it is generally, you know, consistent with the key direction. Not consistent, generally consistent. It's in the key directions report. So staff are going to look at trying to incorporate it. But we've already had a motion to reflect that. It seems to me maybe we don't even need this one, particularly if it's causing us some concern about the wording. Staff, if we didn't, if we simply withdrew this motion and were silent, as opposed to defeating it, would there be any change?
Without further direction, probably not. We
So
would
we would-
bring forward a draft map.
You wouldn't bring forward the
No,
map?
we would. We
You
would
would.
bring forward a draft
Okay.
map with what we think is a reasonable proposal and take feedback on it and
Okay.
refine if necessary.
So we might have been better off, if people don't want to see that happen, to motion to tell them not to do it. We've already had a motion that they're going to respond to by bringing this forward in the OCP draft. And what we're struggling with now is some wording that we're uncomfortable with. And it sounds like this wording isn't going to make a big difference on what staff bring forward. So I had Councillor O'Keefe first, then Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you. Thanks for those comments. I guess what I think is important is, you know, whether it's important to have something like this passed by council so that there's an opportunity for others to give feedback. I don't know. But the thing that I struggle with is the thing about the 5-minute neighborhood distance. And so what I'm okay with is, what I think we're trying to do is, say in places where there's commercial nodes already, like where the gas station and the liquor store is over on the west side there, that perhaps residential areas adjacent to that would be subject to, you know, multiplexer. I'm okay with that. I don't know if that's the intent. But what I'm not so in favor of is what we kind of saw was it on Sealark Place over in Gallaran area, where we plot, you know, the proposal was for a, you know, a small multifamily dwelling right smack in the middle of the neighborhood. And according to the, you know, this would, you know, 5-minute neighborhood. So it's a 5-minute distance from a commercial area, so it fits that, but it didn't fit right smack in the middle of the neighborhood. If it was adjacent, if 5-minute neighborhood wasn't there, and if it said adjacent to existing commercial hubs, then to me that would make sense, because we're not plopping things in the middle of a neighborhood already. We're sort of building out from a commercial.
Yes, and actually that comment really clarifies for me what maybe some of the concern is. So the idea, I think, is more the former, which is, we have these neighborhood commercial nodes, and that contiguous to them, there would be an area of townhouse development. The issue there, of course, is that, likely we wouldn't redesignate just one row of homes for the potential of townhouse development. It would likely be a small area, and in that area, there's no way to determine which property would develop at which time. So it is possible that the first property to develop could be the furthest one away, 5 properties away, for example, with the idea in the future that the remaining properties between the node and that first property to develop could be redeveloped. But when that happens, it would appear to an extent that this property in the middle of the sea of single-family homes is redeveloping. And unless you look at the long-term land use plan, where it shows this node surrounded by a small area of townhouses, you wouldn't have that context to say, okay, I see what they're doing here over the longer term. Now, redesignating one line of houses so that they happen in sequence is generally not done, because it just, you're talking 200 years for no one would think about doing any more commercial use if the intensity increase in the commercial node. So someone deciding to go in there and add another coffee shop or something like that, in a lot of cases, that increased business use is predicated on the potential for more customers coming. So that reciprocal, customer business relationship, and essentially an increase in density, commercial on one side, residential on the other. And so you're saying in this land use map where you've got a commercial node surrounded by the potential for redevelopment that, yes, you could invest in this commercial node because the town is to allow an increase in density in this area around it. And that's enshrined in a long-term plan.
And just a follow-up.
Sure.
So I guess what I'm also thinking is, thinking about the existing, say, gas station and liquor store, so that you've got a commercial node there surrounded. So if you're anticipating that you want to build that commercial node even more, and so do you have a buffer there? Then would you be looking at extending the boundaries of that commercial node to allow for expanded commercial space, to build up that node to allow for other businesses and services, if that's what our intent is? So that, we want to put a coffee shop in there and maybe a small grocery store or something. So do you have to allow for that as well?
Well, I would say that's very dependent on the property. So in the case of the one on Kenora Road there, that's quite a large property. And, probably you've got 100 years of commercial potential there. In other areas, like Rest Haven Store, for example, it's pretty much all developed around Rest Haven Store, but it's a single small corner store, and were there a single family house right beside it, yeah, there might be some potential to increase that neighborhood commercial node if it made sense to do so. We do have a zone in the zoning bylaw right now. No properties are actually zoned that. It's there to provide the potential for a commercial property owner like the one on Kenora, for example, to redevelop to a 3-story mixed-use commercial node. So, coffee shop, small office building, and then a couple floors of residential above. And so I think the eventual idea there is, a 3-story commercial node where you've got customers on site as well as the commercial uses, and then tapering off to maybe some townhouses surrounding it and single family further out. So you've got kind of a graduated land use up toward that commercial node. But again, typically the way this happens is that an area gets redesignated, and well, I guess like on Rest Haven 7th beside Sydney Elementary, you've got a couple of single families in and amongst 4-story buildings. And the reason it's like that is because the town has in the past designated that whole area as residential, multifamily, and then zoned it as RM7. And the redevelopment happens at different times on different properties, and it's typically, you know, a developer's able to get this property next to another one, and so it's very random the way it happens. Yeah, so it is possible that there could be gaps in the urban fabric where you have the neighborhood node, 3 houses, and then a small townhouse development. And I think the idea there is to keep the townhouse development the same scale as the single family, so you don't have a 4-story building next to, you know, a small cottage style single family development. So you do have some comparability in scale. And there's lots of examples in Sydney where you have townhouse development next to single family next to something else, and you know, nobody thinks about it because it's been there for 30 years. And this is the reason as well that I think staff has tried to highlight this, because it does represent land use change, and people notice land use change and probably call you about it. And so we thought it's worthy of highlighting. We certainly don't want anyone to be surprised later on in the process and feel like there was no discussion on this topic. So, thank you.
Okay, so we've had a pretty good discussion. Mayor McNeil-Smith?
I would move withdrawal of the motion.
I don't think you need to move withdrawing.
Sorry.
Is it okay with the seconder?
Yes, thank you.
Does any member of withdrawn? Because the committee owns it once it's moved and seconded. I'm not seeing anyone objecting to withdrawing. Okay, it's being withdrawn. Mayor McNeil-Smith?
Thank you, Chair. And I do appreciate Chair Wainwright's comments with regards to the option that we've just proceeded with and some of the rationale. The motions we've made thus far, our first motion was to refer all policy directions and the key directions to the draft OCP. But we've made other motions, and the purpose behind those was to provide additional clarity to these important particular policy directions, and I think this is an important one as well. So I will move this the motion that staff bring forward a map in the draft OCP referring to townhouses, multiplex developments, and commercial nodes within Sydney's single-family residential neighborhoods.
Okay. Did you catch that motion? Okay. Is there a seconder? And
Mr. Humble.
so, Mr. Humble?
If I could, through the chair, I just wanted to clarify, I think you said a map. I think it may be more appropriate to say within the map of the OCP. So again, we have an existing OCP map that would accompany the draft OCP. This would be a draft map that would accompany that, and it was already articulated, I think, in the approach report that we always have an OCP land use designated map, so it's existing. So it would come forward, as Mr. Newcomb has articulated, regardless.
Yeah, it's through the chair, thank you, through the chair, thank you, Mr. Humble. Yeah, the comment is that if we don't make a motion, then we're left with a reference in the key directions report that's going to go to the public and go to advisory committees making reference to 5-minute and making reference to locating within the commercial nodes. And I think really this is a land use decision that actually brings densification if we bring townhouses and multiplexes within existing single-family dwellings, and I think it needs to be viewed in that context, and that if there's some reference to commercial nodes as well, that's fine, but I guess I have some concern in terms of tying future density to what is uncertain to be in these very small and often single-use commercial uses that they're going to be in their long term, and we're making our density decisions on a particular commercial use that may not be there.
So we haven't had a seconder yet, and I'm not sure that we got the motion recorded properly either. So let's pause the debate and see if we've got a seconder.
I'll second for discussion.
Councillor Rentoul
Do we have the
seconding.
motion okay?
And yeah, the only question is whether we've got the motion recorded.
I've got most of it, and I'll go back to recording to make sure I get the wording right.
Okay, great. So, if you could give your best shot to it.
Give my best shot. So it was that staff bring forward the map and draft OCP referring to townhouse multiplex developments and commercial nodes within Sydney's single-family residences.
Okay, did that catch the comment that Mr. Humble made?
I believe so. It
Okay,
referred to the
thank you.
map.
The
That's
map,
correct.
yes.
Okay, so we've heard the motion again. Mr. Newcomb?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think what might be helpful and provide a lot of clarity when we get to that point is to bring forward the draft OCP land use map as a separate item for discussion. You know, the OCP will have a lot of policy in it, and that the policy can be discussed in detail as well. But the OCP map is really where the land use change takes place, and the land use change is the stuff that really interests people. You know, especially when it happens, but also, you know, I think people want to see where a community is going, and if that land use map is brought forward as a separate item and highlighted, you know, the areas of change can be highlighted for discussion. You know, not that a motion or anything needs to be made. I'm just suggesting a way to bring clarity to this when we get to that point.
If I could, it seems to me the kind of process and analysis that you're talking about, and you know, the consideration of where these opportunities might be, is actually the kind of thing that APC is intended to do. And it would seem to me that it would make a lot of sense for the OCP team to use the APC in working on developing that particular proposal.
If council would like to refer this item to APC for discussion, we'd be happy to have a detailed discussion with APC on it. Absolutely.
We have a motion on the floor that's being seconded. Is there further debate? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Okay.
I'll move to, as worded under E, that policy to support the implementation of an all ages and abilities cycling network across Sydney be included in the draft OCP.
Second?
So that's moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing none, call the question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried.
Under F, slightly different beginning wording, that policy to support increased density at a medium scale, i.e. 2 to 3 stories adjacent to Mermaid Creek drainage course, to the Mermaid Creek drainage course, and then a more detailed approach to the redevelopment of the affected parcels be included as part of the draft OCP.
And do I have a seconder?
Second?
Okay, it's being seconded. Discussion? Councillor Garnett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I won't support this particular recommendation, although I completely understand the rationale that staff has put forward. I see risks in increasing density around environmentally sensitive areas. And I say that because in 2015, I didn't even know we had them before I started coming to council, and neither did anybody I know. And I would think many people in our community don't know we have them. So people move into the neighborhood, they might come from somewhere else, they're not going to know. And although I like to think that people would be protective and aware and take care in these areas, you can't be guaranteed of that. And human behavior is what it is. Increases the risks of spills, things being put in there, people going into the area they shouldn't be going into. And I think the more people you put into that area, the greater that risk becomes. So I feel like that, not just for this area, but for every environmentally sensitive area we have in Sydney. So, yeah, feel free.
With your permission, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
So the area we're talking about here right now is not an environmentally sensitive area. This is to the south of the Mermaid Creek environmentally sensitive area. This is the area where the creek has been essentially completely destroyed and is in a pipe under single-family homes. I think the idea here is to eventually create an extended Mermaid Creek environmentally sensitive area. So the area we're talking about here, and again, this would come forward in a detailed land use map, but is the area at the southern tip of the existing Mermaid Creek ESA to approximately the library, just north of the library. So that area is zoned a variety of things right now, single family and multifamily. And most of Mermaid Creek is in a pipe running under those properties and is a designated municipal drainage course. The idea here is to free up that land that's on top of that pipe and, 60, 80 years in the future, restore it to the point where you can run a ESA down that strip of reclaimed land. Again, this is a very long-term, difficult road to travel. It'll take a lot of persistence over many years to make this happen. I think the idea here is to start that process, but this is not doing anything in and around the Roberts Bay ESA or the Mermaid Creek ESA. It's strictly south of that where the creek has been piped, and the intent here is to change the land use so there's an opportunity to unpipe that creek without having to outright buy that land at $1 million a lot. And so just to clarify that. Thank you.
Sorry, appreciating that, what your further clarification, but these areas are all intertwined, and I still feel like if where you're going with it goes in that direction, and you're able to open it back up again, you've created an opportunity where there's now, if it hypothetically happens, you've got multiple places like this in that area, you're still increasing the potential for, even if it is an environmentally sensitive now, it does lead into environmentally sensitive areas. So there is an indirect or direct impact, whatever way you look at it. They all sort of feed in together. So I'm just thinking in terms of longer term, what impact that might have. And I think if we make that decision now, I guess it can be revisited in the future, but what happens in the interim?
Well, there really is only two methods to free up land with the eventual goal of doing some level of environmental restoration. One is to buy that land and knock down the house and convert it to essentially parkland and re-daylight the creek in there, yeah. Or move the stuff that's on top of the creek bed right now over. And so, if you can assemble 4 lots and the property redevelops with everything on the side 2 lots, and those 2 lots are now free, and there's a covenant put on that land or some dedication of land back to the municipality as a condition of that rezoning, then rather than, if the municipality chooses not to buy land and do that kind of restoration, the only way that happens is through a redevelopment process. Otherwise, 80 years in the future, you're still going to have water flowing in a pipe under a house. And the only difference is the house has been redeveloped. So that's the genesis of this idea, I guess, to provide
I appreciate
context.
It's extremely difficult to.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think in terms of the broader picture, the bigger picture, in terms of this just individual and how it impacts everything else down the line.
Yeah.
So, but I appreciate what your comments are. Thank you.
So
Thank you,
I've
Mr.
got
Chair.
Mayor McNeil-Smith and then Councillor Fowler.
Just a quick question. If you daylight the section from where it goes flows into Mermaid Creek now back to Level Road, which is I think the intent in the long term, is the intent not for that stretch to become an environmentally sensitive area?
Well, first of all, I would think any daylighting process would really need a whole corridor kind of assembled to happen, right? You wouldn't, if there's one redevelopment, say 5 years from now, you wouldn't just go in and re-daylight a 30-meter section of that creek, probably, right? You'd be looking at what the section they did down near Oak Bay High School with Bowker Creek, where it was a, several 100-meter stretch of that creek that was, redone essentially. And then, okay, in 2050, maybe that happens to an extent that you've got a decent section of daylighted creek. At that time, I think it would make sense to go in there and put an ESA essentially on top of that area, would be the idea.
I'm comfortable letting this go forward to further comment from.
Councillor Fallon?
Thank you. I would also think that as this is a multi-decade plan, that there's a whole educational process that goes with it. And I think as this is going to be taking decades and probably certainly well past my lifetime, that a lot of it's happening, that people will become more aware. And I think that is the opportunity to have seen Roberts Bay and look at the portion of Mermaid Creek that is open and then where it starts to become covered over. I think it is a goal, and as you said earlier, Mr. Newcomb, best time to plant a tree is, at least a decade before you start talking about it. So if we're going to do something, I think we have to set the map in place, and the educational aspect of it will be going hand in hand anyhow. Thank you.
So we have the motion on the floor. Any further discussion? Seeing none, call the question. All in favor? Opposed? One opposed? Okay, and moving on.
Thank you. I'd like to move, it's actually number 4, is in the recommendations that the town issue a media release regarding the purpose, policy directions, and project context of the key directions report, and invite public comment for a 4-week period.
And is there a seconder?
Second.
Seconded by Councillor Garnett. Discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried.
Next, the number 2, that the key directions report be referred to the Advisory Planning Commission for review and comment.
Second.
That's seconded. Discussion? I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried.
The number 3, that comments received from the public and the Advisory Planning Commission be referred to the OCP Review Advisory Committee for their review and comment.
Okay, is there a seconder?
Second.
Okay, discussion? Seeing none, call the question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried.
And what's worded under number 5, that the purpose, policy directions, and project context of the key directions report be promoted through social media and the town's website.
Is there a seconder?
Second.
Okay, discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried.
And lastly, that staff be directed to proceed with phase 3 of the OCP review and update project.
Second.
Okay, discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Any further motions? Seeing none, that completes that item, and that completes our agenda. So
Move
a
adjournment.
motion to adjourn,
Second.
and seconded. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much, and we're adjourned.